Now joining us, Amber Northern, and she's the Senior Vice President for Research at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. She wants to talk about a new report. I think it's significant. If you're any of the states in our great United States, all 50 of you have insight when you look at this report, but particularly in the state of Alaska, where we have our show, it's bothersome when you have the grade of F. And that report is titled The State of State Standards for Civics and U.S. History in 2021. Amber, thanks so much for joining us.
Happy to be here and join the conversation.
Absolutely. Well, let's get into this. It looks like the report evaluates the quality of, kindergarten through 12th grade civics and U.S. history standards adopted by all 50 states and even Washington, D.C., and that's as of May, a couple months ago, 2021. And you give a basis like content, rigor, clarity, organization, and I would love to know how you decided on those qualifiers or measures, but let's get into this. And man, a whopping F for Alaska. That doesn't bode well for us.
Oh, it's terrible. It's terrible. I mean, you guys were in the bottom of the heap with about, 20 some other states with Fs in both subject areas. And we can talk about that in a minute. But big picture is, this it's exceedingly important to know what kids are required to know in civics and U.S. history, given the lack of knowledge. This has sort of been the joke of late night TV on how little Americans know about their government and their history. But it's not so funny when you really start digging in and you realize that I think it's less than 15% of kids can pass a national test about U.S. history. So it's bad news for many places, and we need to do better.
When I see 20 states rated inadequate, I mean, that means they get a D or an F in these subjects. And I know any parents or grandparents out there listening, you're not going to be really thrilled with your youngster bringing in a D or an F. This report is essentially helping identify what strong and weak civics and history, U.S. history standards there are and what they look like. Do you get into improvements as well? Is this just let's pull the curtain back and voila, look at how bad we're doing in the United States? Or do you also toss on and sprinkle on a smidgen of remedy?
Yeah, lots of remedy. I mean, each of the states has about 5 or 6 pages that goes into detail about what the state expects those kids to know in those subjects, and then offers, yes, a handful of recommendations to get them out of the D and F range and get them into the A and B range. The biggest thing we saw with the states that did so poorly was just the lack of detail. It seems like some states are kind of scared that they're going to offend somebody or offend an interest group, so they've kind of taken the safe approach, which is, be very vague in general and say things like, understand time, places, and institutions and how historical themes play out, which is a standard in Alaska, by the way, which really means nothing. So, if you don't name any persons, places, or events or processes, teachers have no idea what they're supposed to be teaching, and that's not good news, because that means that no matter, it's all going to be based on what school district your kid happens to land in as to whether or not the districts improve upon the crummy guidance from the state.
The Fordham Institute, you can go to fordhaminstitute.org. I just posted on the Tom Anderson Show Facebook page the link so you can check out the report for those of you listening live and local or listening online. Your organization does what? So people understand. Maybe they can follow it. Maybe they can donate to it. Maybe they can get involved and support you in whatever way you wish. First, tell us, though, the genesis of the organization and your involvement.
I love that question. So Thomas B. Fordham Institute, we do research and commentary around pretty much anything that touches K-12 education. So we research all these different types of issues that touch on K-12 education. And sure, my role is I oversee the research, but I started as a high school teacher, and that's the hat that I find myself putting on quite a bit, because if I had standards that looked like these, I wouldn't know what to do with them. I mean, you really have to have much more clear guidance for teachers, or you're just kind of, leaving them out, hanging them out to dry.
And as a teacher, you say that you've taught in high school. we look at the labyrinth of, there are school districts, and in Alaska we have boroughs. Some states have borough type structures. Most have counties, and we have these school districts where sometimes counties are merged, big city school districts, smaller rural school districts, thousands and thousands and thousands of teachers, millions of students. How does the change of a curriculum occur? Is it from a parent-teacher association that goes to and lobbies and advocates at a school district? Is it within the school?
Right. So normally adoption of curriculum takes place at the district level. It can take place at the school level, but that's more rare. And absolutely, parents can have a role in this. I mean, this is why I've just been encouraging folks, go to the website, download what your state requires, and if you don't like what you see, show up at the next school board meeting and say, why did this, nationally nonpartisan organization give us a D or an F? And then advocate for improving. I mean, these are not divisive things we're asking kids to learn. This is the Declaration of Independence and, the Constitution and the Gettysburg Address. And we want kids to know about the colonial period, the Revolutionary War and the Civil War and both world wars. I mean, if you sit down and talk to people, no matter where no matter what their politics are, they're going to agree that kids need to know those things. So, again, this is just the nuts and bolts of what kids should know. And on the civic side, it's things like how do our elections work? What does it mean to have due process? What do we, how are governments formed and how do they overlap? And what does separation of powers mean? And what do our three branches of government do? So again, this shouldn't be divisive. It shouldn't be political. This is what we, as reasonable people, we can come together and say, yes, that's the stuff kids should know. And if states aren't requiring it, they need to do better.
Absolutely. We're talking with Amber Northern. I think she can stick with us through one more break here. Senior Vice President for Research at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. And she's come on the show to talk about Fordham's. It's really a significant new report in the education realm. It's the State of State Standards for Civics and U.S. History in 2021. And I want to come back and I want to talk with her about her experience in high school. If she's been out of the game for a while, she can talk about maybe that evolution, the transition, what it would be like to be teaching now. I'm sure she has teachers in her family or collective or sphere of influence, or she knows them. And as they compile this data, I also want to toss in there, dare I say, critical race theory, and whether she weighs in on the constructs of it. We can talk about at a macro level how that's affecting sentiment in education centers, and is it degrading morale for students, for teachers, for parents when we hear this antagonistic mindset in schools rather than an open, loving educational environment like I went and our producer Rick went to. He went in Oklahoma, I went in Alaska. We had great school experiences. So we're going to come right back. We're going to talk about that. I want you all to consider that as well. That could be your homework assignment this week, to consider what you'd like to see in a curriculum. She just listed a bunch of amazing topics that I think are integral to being a U.S. citizen and understanding our history. So we'll be right back with Amber Northern of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute here on The Tom Anderson Show. So when you think about history and civics, and maybe you shudder at the thought, I loved it in school, and I know Rick Milliken, our producer, loved it as well, and it's something that we're interested in. It's part of the reason I was on the Anchorage School Board and have a master's degree in government and a law degree, and I really enjoy politics. I was a state representative as well, as many of you know, and I'm into the civic structure and municipal government and state and federal, and that's where, when there is analysis, when there are reports, when there are studies that go over particularly curriculums and how states are doing, I take interest. And Amber Northern, Senior Vice President for Research at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, I think feels the same way. The new report entitled The State of the State Standards for Civics and U.S. History in 2021 is really illuminating. It's insightful. They have a basically synopsis of what's going on in states. And Amber, we can dig into this. I mean, I'm looking at the negative side, the 20 states with inadequate ratings, D or F, and Alaska's there, but there are some good ones as well. It says here, ultimately 5 jurisdictions received exemplary ratings based on their A grades in both subjects: Alabama, California, Massachusetts, Tennessee, and the District of Columbia. Is that good, bad? I mean, when I think of California, I get a little unnerved at all the shenanigans going on there. Tell us about how this is broken down, who did well and not.
Yeah. I mean, that was surprising, I think, to us, because that group you just mentioned are both red and blue states. We didn't see a pattern where, red states all scored great and blue states scored poorly. It was all over the map. And in a way, that was encouraging to us, because it says, you know what, despite all the politics and the infighting of the day, if adults come together and actually want to write accurate and factual history standards that aren't biased and leading and ideological, it can be done. And so, again, why can't these F states take a page from the A and B states? We think it's ridiculous that states, all want to act like they're completely 100% unique when it comes to U.S. history. Of course, states should cover their own state history, which is important and rich and important, key for kids to know. But again, all kids should be exposed to the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and so on and so forth, that I could go through and name these nuts and bolts. That should not depend on where you live. So again, there's a lot of commonality between states, and if these F states just merely want to get an idea of how to raise their grades, they should look to these A and B states.
And you, in your report, talk about states with exemplary civics and U.S. history standards and ways that they accomplish such rating. You talk about, in contrast, states with inadequate civics and U.S. history standards like Alaska, and you get into the details there. And then you address the weaknesses, and you have recommendations like maximizing civics and U.S. history coverage in elementary and middle school, and require at least 1 year of U.S. history and 1 semester of civics in high school. I mean, back when I was in school in the 80s, they did require that. You also mentioned providing more specific and detailed guidance in both subjects, and you put more emphasis in writing, augmentation, problem analysis. These are, I think, very important, rather than rotely to memorize and go through, to say, hey, what would you have done? Let's think about this. Consider the time, the economy, the powers to be, the exchanges at play. All those things make someone critically think. Speaking of, drum roll please, critically thinking, critical race theory, CRT, is the big mainstream topic in news, which leans left of center typically. We cover it on this show. I'm not a fan. I know there's a lawmaker, State Representative Tom McKay in the great state of Alaska, that's considering writing, like other states have passed, a legislation that, if it were to be passed in Alaska, would prohibit critical race theory. What's your take on critical race theory?
Yeah, I mean, my take is ask people what it means to them, because I feel like there's so much misunderstanding, and when we talk in abstracts, it's very unnerving. And so if it means dividing kids into racial groups and having some of them be labeled oppressors and some of them be labeled the oppressed as kindergarten, first and second graders, that's ridiculous. If it means asking young children to declare their white privilege as a child, that's ridiculous. On the other hand, if it means that kids get exposed to a variety of literature from various authors and cultures in their English class, I think everyone agrees that's a good idea. We don't want kids just reading, things written by sort of dead white men, is the phrase some people use. If it means hiring diverse teachers so that kids have role models that share their race and background, most people say, of course, that's a good idea. So honestly, if it means, that we don't whitewash our history and that we actually, name slavery as a key driver and cause of the Civil War, of course, we need to be accurate and factual. So again, the devil's in the details. And some of these ridiculous practices that you hear being bandied about, I think when most people hear them, they go, oh no, that's a really, really bad idea. I mean, I think, again, most people would agree that every racial disparity in our society is not caused by racism, that we've also got several other complicated factors like poverty and other socioeconomic factors. So to boil it all down to one thing, I think strikes most reasonable people as incomplete.
Fair enough. Amber Northern is her name, Senior Vice President for Research at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. Now, Amber, you were a teacher at one time. In what state, may I ask, and area did you teach?
Yeah, I was in North Carolina and Virginia.
And when you look at teaching today, not just curriculums, but the environment itself. Are you glad you're out? Do you miss it? Or does it really depend on where you would teach?
Yeah. I do miss it, but I wouldn't want to go back. It is tough. And I think if you talk to any teacher today, a lot of them are just, really stressed out. It's a lot of pressure, especially now with COVID and trying to catch kids up. So many kids missed so much learning last year, and it's a tall challenge to get them all caught up, and also to meet all their mental and social, emotional needs. I mean, some of these kids, are in pretty bad home situations and home lives, and school is the safest place for them to be. So in some cases, unfortunately, we saw, more kids, turning up in emergency rooms and so on and so forth for emotional and mental needs. So hats off to teachers today. I think most people feel the same way that I do, that it's a tough job, but oh my gosh, how important of a job is it?
Of all my public service, from zoning board to parking authority to lawmaker to school board, the toughest was being on the school board in Anchorage, and I'm sure it's the same in other states and cities where we had to deal with truancy, we had to deal with discipline issues, we had to deal with, do we cut a sports team, or are we going to build that or not? Are we going to renovate a school or not? How much credibility do we give to a complaint? PTAs, teachers, unions, are kids getting enough food, the stress, the mental health, and all those dimensions, and you pull them together. As a teacher, you're on the front lines, and I look at your report. Do you put the onus, do you put the liability, the responsibility, the remedy on one actor, the teacher, the administrator, the student, the parent, or is it really a collective? It takes a village.
Yeah, it definitely takes a village. And I think, our report is just saying state lawmakers and state boards of education have a very important role, and they should not, abdicate their responsibility to lay out the nuts and bolts of what kids need to know in these two vital subjects. And then, of course, local districts then, take the reins from that point and then adopt the curricula that then builds on those standards, put the meat and the flesh on the bones, but don't let, states off the hook. They've got to set out the guidelines and parameters to position school districts where they can succeed in teaching kids these two subjects.
Beyond Stephen, your guru, who's a brilliant gentleman, and I work with great pleasure because he brings all-stars like you onto our program. Beyond your PR and media efforts, last question, and we're going to cut you loose, and we'll make a YouTube video of this. So, folks, you can follow this, and we'll put the links in the YouTube video as well so you can read this report. And I'll remind you before we close, but last question, very quickly, are you sending this report to school districts across the nation or to lawmakers, city governments, or all of the above, or none of the above?
Yes, we are. But hey, with the background I just learned you had, I hope you can help us get it to your former colleagues and friends, because those are the people that need to read it and get it in front of them. Absolutely, we're sharing it far and wide, and we want policymakers to actually require kids to take civics and history to graduate, which is another thing, believe it or not, that a lot of states are not doing.
Absolutely. I agree. I'd love to get you back in the future as you have more reports. This is stellar, all-star work. Amber Northern is her name, Senior Vice President for Research at the Fordham Institute. And this report's entitled The State of State Standards for Civics and U.S. History in 2020, when, as I alluded to, it's critical for school boards, school districts, lawmakers, assembly members, mayors, governors to read. Amber, keep up the good work. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Tom Anderson Show, good morning.